Welcome back to Crime Story with Camila. Today we talk about a chilling story of the disturbing case of Tanima, a child bride's revenge. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos. In a remote village tucked away from the modern world, a young girl named Tanima lived a life defined by innocence and hope. At just 12 years old, she dreamed of simple things, attending school, playing with friends, and exploring the wonders of a life she had barely begun to understand. But in this village, tradition was an unyielding force, and girls like Tanima were often seen as burdens to their families. When her parents, under the weight of poverty and societal expectations, arranged her marriage to the local Imam, a man decades older than her, it marked the beginning of a harrowing journey. Tanima's story begins like many others, a young girl full of potential, with dreams and hopes shaped by the innocence of childhood. Born into a modest family in a small village, Tanima was loved and cherished by her parents. She was bright, with a curious mind and a thirst for knowledge. Despite the limited resources, her parents did everything they could to give her a sense of normalcy and joy. Tanima's days were spent in the company of her younger siblings, playing games and helping her mother with household chores. She had a natural ability to connect with others, often making friends with the children in her village. Her laughter echoed through the simple, dirt-lined streets, and her future seemed full of promise. But in a society deeply rooted in tradition, Tanima's future was already mapped out for her. Her family's financial struggles were a constant source of stress, and the weight of cultural expectations loomed large. In their community, girls were married young, often seen as financial burdens rather than individuals with their own ambitions. When Tanima was just 12 years old, her parents were approached by the village elders, including the respected Imam, who promised stability and honor in exchange for their daughter's hand in marriage. The Imam, an older, powerful figure in the community, convinced Tanima's family that this was a good opportunity, one that would bring respect and resources to them in their time of need. Reluctantly, and with little understanding of the full consequences, Tanima's parents agreed. The girl who once dreamed of a future of possibility was now bound by the chains of tradition. Her life irrevocably changed in the blink of an eye. For Tanima, her childhood was over. Her world, once filled with laughter and dreams, was now marked by an oppressive silence, as her innocence was stripped away in ways no child should ever have to endure. The girl who once asked why to every question about life now found herself trapped, forced into a role she was far too young to understand. But even in the darkest corners of her life, Tanima carried within her a strength, a silent, simmering determination that would one day lead her down a path no one could have ever predicted. Tanima's life after marriage could not have been further from what she had imagined. Instead of the joyful beginning of a new chapter, her wedding marked the start of a nightmare she couldn't escape. At 12 years old, she was thrust into the household of the Imam, a man much older than her, and into a world completely foreign to her, a world of control, isolation, and abuse. From the very first day, Tanima was overwhelmed by the reality of her new life. The Imam, revered by the community for his religious standing, turned out to be a man who used his power and authority to dominate her. His kindness was a mask, hiding the controlling and manipulative nature that would soon define her existence. She was denied any contact with her family, her childhood friends, and even the outside world. The Imam insisted she stay within the confines of their home, where her only role was to serve him. Her once promising education was replaced with the endless cycle of housework and submission. Tanima's days were spent in silence, as she was stripped of the freedom to play, laugh, or learn. The Imam's behavior soon grew more cruel. He imposed strict rules on her, expecting complete obedience and compliance. Any sign of rebellion, any attempt to question her situation, was met with punishment. Over time, Tanima's spirit began to break. She no longer recognized the girl she once was. The vibrant, curious child who had longed to explore the world was now a shadow, living in fear and desperation. Physical abuse became a regular part of her life. The Imam, in moments of anger, would lash out, leaving her bruised and battered. But it wasn't just the physical pain that wore Tanima down, it was the emotional and psychological torment. She was told time and time again that she was nothing without him, that her worth came only from serving him, and that she was nothing more than a child bride, a possession to be controlled. Tanima's isolation was complete. She had no one to turn to, no one who could help her. The village, wrapped in its traditions and religious beliefs, closed its eyes to the reality of what was happening behind the Imam's doors. He was a respected man, a spiritual leader, and in their eyes, his actions were beyond reproach. But despite the crushing weight of her situation, Tanima's mind began to churn with thoughts of escape, of freedom. The more she endured, the more her mind became a battleground, torn between the years of indoctrination that taught her to submit and the growing fire within her that demanded to be free. It was this internal struggle, this unrelenting desire for liberation, that set the stage for what would come next. As the months passed, Tanima's life only grew more unbearable. The world outside her home seemed like a distant memory, a life she could no longer grasp. Every day, she was reminded of her helplessness. The Imam, the man who had promised her a life of respect and stability, became the embodiment of everything that crushed her spirit. His cruelty took many forms, but it was his emotional manipulation that began to cut the deepest. Tanima's sense of self, once bright and full of hope, was slowly being erased. Every small act of resistance, whether it was an unwillingness to cook a meal at the right time or a brief moment of defiance in the way she spoke, was met with punishment. She was told she was worthless, that no one would ever care for her, that she was only a child and had no right to question the life she had been forced into. But it was not only the Imam's abuse that pushed her to the edge. There was a more devastating realization that took root in her heart, a realization that, no matter how hard she tried, no one would save her. Her parents, the very people who had once held her in their arms, had abandoned her. The promises they made, that her marriage would bring honor, seemed like lies. They were now part of the system that had sentenced her to a life of suffering, too caught up in their own struggles to notice the depths of her pain. Tanima began to feel trapped, suffocated by the walls of her own existence. She was a prisoner in her own life, with no escape in sight. She had no voice, no agency, no power. Every time she tried to speak up, she was silenced. Every time she hoped for a change, that hope was crushed under the weight of her reality. The Imam was always there, watching, controlling, and taking. Then came a day that would change everything. It was a night like any other, filled with tension and fear. The Imam had been particularly cruel, berating her for something as small as a delayed meal. His words, laced with venom, cut into her like never before. He told her she would never be more than a child in his eyes, that she was nothing without him. But something inside Tanima snapped. The anger, the pain, the humiliation, all of it came crashing down at once. She no longer cared about the consequences. The idea of enduring another day in this hellish existence was more terrifying than any punishment the Imam could inflict. She had reached her breaking point. That night, Tanima took a quiet, calculated step toward her future, a future she would take into her own hands, no matter the cost. With a sense of resolve she hadn't known she possessed, she planned her final act of defiance. What followed would be a night that no one in the village would ever forget, a night when a young girl, once silenced and oppressed, would break free in the most shocking and irreversible way. The night Tanima had been dreading, yet secretly preparing for, arrived in the quiet of the Imam's home. The oppressive silence that filled the walls of their small house seemed heavier than ever. Tanima's heart raced as she steeled herself for what she knew she had to do. Every nerve in her body screamed for escape, but there was no way out, at least, not in the way she had once imagined. That night, the Imam was angry. His temper had been flaring throughout the day, and Tanima, as always, bore the brunt of his frustrations. He'd been drinking more than usual, a habit that only made his cruelty more unpredictable. When she entered the room with his food, his sharp words lashed out, accusing her of being careless. Tanima's hands trembled, but she knew the routine. She would serve him, apologize, and pray that the night would pass without further violence. But this time, something was different. As Tanima approached him, she noticed the knife on the counter, a sharp, gleaming tool that had been used countless times to prepare meals. The knife had been a silent companion in her daily tasks, a symbol of her subjugation, but tonight, it would become her instrument of survival. The Imam continued his tirade, his voice louder now, mocking her for her youth, for her powerless existence. Tanima stood there, her body rigid, her mind spiraling through a whirlwind of anger, fear, and desperation. She could feel the cold, metallic handle of the knife in her hand, its weight a stark reminder of what was at stake. She had no plan, no specific moment when she'd decided this would be the end. But the years of suffering, the years of silencing her pain, the years of abuse, all of it surged within her, propelling her forward. In a split second, Tanima made her decision. As the Imam turned to shout at her again, she seized the opportunity. With all her might, she thrust the knife into his chest, the blade slicing through the air in a blur. The Imam gasped, his expression one of disbelief and shock. He stumbled backward, clutching his chest in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding, but it was too late. Tanima stood frozen, the weight of her actions crashing down on her in waves. The Imam, once a figure of authority and power, was now a broken man lying in a pool of his own blood. The room, once filled with his harsh words and oppressive presence, was now eerily quiet. The sounds of Tanima's heartbeat were the only thing she could hear, pounding in her ears. As the Imam's life slipped away, Tanima felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't the satisfaction of revenge, nor was it the joy of having finally freed herself from his control. It was a feeling she couldn't quite explain, freedom, maybe, but freedom that came at an unimaginable cost. In that moment, Tanima realized there would be no going back. What had begun as an act of survival, an attempt to end the cycle of pain and fear, had now become something much larger, a tragedy that would shake the foundations of her community and spark debates on justice, child marriage, and the rights of young girls. As the Imam lay dying, Tanima made her way to the door. She didn't know what the future held, or whether anyone would understand what had driven her to this moment. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope that, somehow, she might find a way to live again. The news of the Imam's death spread like wildfire through the village. What had been a quiet and unexpected act of violence was now the talk of every household, every street corner. In the eyes of the community, Tanima had committed the unthinkable. She had killed a man revered for his position and influence. It didn't matter that he had been an abuser, a tyrant in disguise. He was still seen as a holy man, a figure of authority. Tanima was now the villain, the murderer, the one who had destroyed the sanctity of their community. The initial reaction from the villagers was one of shock and disbelief. How could such a thing happen? How could a young girl, barely more than a child, murder her husband? The narrative quickly began to form. Tanima was simply a disobedient, troubled girl who had gone too far. Her past suffering, her cries for help, none of it mattered in the face of the public's need to uphold their traditions. But there were whispers, small but growing, that began to question the story being told. Some began to ask, what had driven her to this point? What had led a young, innocent girl to take such a drastic step? Were they overlooking the years of emotional and physical abuse she had suffered? Had the Imam's influence over her really been one of care and protection, or was it a twisted manipulation of power? Despite these questions, Tanima was arrested and quickly thrown into the legal system. In a society where women and girls had little voice, especially one as young as Tanima, it was unlikely that her case would be given the attention it deserved. The trial was swift, and the verdict seemed almost predetermined. But as the days went by, the case began to attract attention outside of the village. Human rights activists, journalists, and even organizations focused on child welfare started to take an interest in Tanima's story. Her situation, while extreme, was not unique. The world was beginning to listen to the voices of those who had been silenced for so long, the girls and women caught in the deadly grip of child marriage and patriarchal control. The media coverage was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it brought attention to the injustices Tanima had suffered, painting her not as a villain, but as a victim of a cruel and broken system. Her story ignited outrage from human rights groups, calling for justice not only for Tanima but for all young girls trapped in similar circumstances. They argued that Tanima's act of violence was the result of a system that had failed her, a system that had condoned the abuse of young girls for generations. On the other hand, many in the community and even parts of the media were quick to condemn her, insisting that her actions could not be justified under any circumstances. To them, the Imam's death was a heinous crime, no matter the context. They were unwilling to look beyond the act of murder and consider the years of oppression Tanima had endured. As the trial progressed, Tanima was put under intense scrutiny. She was questioned about her motives, her mental state, and her understanding of the gravity of her actions. Her responses, delivered in a soft, almost childlike voice, revealed the depth of her trauma. She spoke not with malice, but with the resignation of someone who had been pushed to the brink of her endurance. The defense argued that Tanima's actions were not premeditated but were driven by years of abuse and a desperate need to protect herself. Despite the outcry from human rights groups, Tanima was sentenced to a period of detention, though the court stopped short of a lengthy prison term. Her sentence was seen as a form of justice, but also as a recognition of her age and the dire circumstances that had led to the Imam's death. However, her case sparked a larger conversation that could not be ignored. In the months that followed, there were debates about the legality and morality of child marriage, the importance of protecting young girls from abuse, and the need for societal change. Tanima's name became synonymous with a much-needed reckoning, not just with her own situation, but with the deep-seated issues of gender inequality and the mistreatment of young girls in societies around the world. Tanima's story remains one of the most poignant and tragic examples of the complex intersection between child marriage, abuse, and systemic oppression. Her act of violence, though horrifying, was not an isolated incident, but a result of years of emotional, physical, and psychological torment. It served as a harsh wake-up call to a society that had long turned a blind eye to the exploitation of young girls, particularly those forced into marriage with older men under the guise of tradition and religion. While Tanima's actions cannot be excused in the eyes of the law, they underscore the severity of the environment she was trapped in, a place where her voice, her rights, and her autonomy were systematically denied. Her life, once full of hope and promise, had been stolen from her by the very institution that was supposed to protect her. In her mind, there was no way out. The death of the Imam, cruel as it was, became the only route to escape the chains that bound her. Her case sparked a global conversation about child marriage, the abuse of women and girls, and the flaws in legal systems that fail to protect the vulnerable. Activists rallied behind her, demanding justice, not just for Tanima, but for every girl who had been forced into a life of subjugation. They argued that the true crime was not Tanima's act of violence, but the system that had allowed her to be silenced, abused, and exploited for years. In the years following her trial, Tanima's story became a symbol for change. Though her life was irrevocably altered by her actions, it was her courage, her willingness to break free from a life of torment, that inspired others. Many young girls, inspired by her resilience, began to speak out against the violence and abuse they faced in their own lives. Laws were slowly reformed in some regions, and greater awareness was raised about the dangers of child marriage and the abuse it perpetuates. However, Tanima's story also serves as a reminder of the long road ahead. The fight for the rights of young girls, for their freedom from forced marriages, and for their protection from abuse is far from over. While Tanima's act of resistance may have been born from desperation, it also illuminated the need for a world where such acts of violence are not the only means of survival for those trapped in oppressive situations. As for Tanima, her future remains uncertain. She may never be fully able to reclaim the life that was stolen from her, but her story has left an indelible mark on the world. It is a testament to the power of one voice, one act of defiance, in the face of overwhelming odds. In the end, the true tragedy is not just in the death of the Imam or the suffering Tanima endured, but in the countless other girls like her, whose stories remain untold, whose voices remain unheard. It is a stark reminder that the fight for justice and equality must continue, for as long as young girls are being forced into lives of silence and submission, the world will never be free from the shadow of injustice.
Thanks for watching. For more interesting videos, please subscribe.